technically they're not an ELO score, and the biggest difference is that in ELO, the data is processed one match at a time, whereas in Bradley-Terry, the algorithm looks at the entire data set, and those ratings sort of encompass the entire history of votes rather than just the most recent ones.
For someone who's never heard of LMArena, what is the leaderboard?
Okay, yeah, the leaderboard is an overall ranking of the top AI models that are released. We calculate this by having all of our users come in and vote in a blind setting. So they'll come in and give whatever prompt they want. We'll serve them two different responses from different models, and they can choose which one they like better without knowing the identity of the models that they're talking to. And once we get a large amount of votes from different users, we can aggregate these using statistical models into an overall ranking. The scores roughly represent a probability that a user would pick one model over the other. So the higher the score, the more likely users are preferring that model over others.
What does the score actually mean?
So alone, a score actually doesn't mean too much by itself. What matters a lot is the difference between two scores. If I had a score that's 1,000 and another that's 1,200, that would actually mean the exact same thing as if one was 800 and one was 1,000, because what matters is that the difference in 200. The difference in score can be translated to a probability that one model would be chosen over the other. And the larger the difference in score, the larger predicted probability in favor of the model with the higher score. The score is using a statistical model called Bradley-Terry, and it's very similar to ELO scores from chess, which a lot of people might be familiar with. But the main idea is that it does take into account who you win against or who the model is preferred against and who it loses against, but it also takes into account how strong those models are. So it's different from a raw win rate, because being preferred to another strong model will give you a larger gain in score, and losing to a weaker model will lose you a lot of points in a way that's not captured by a raw win rate.
What's the highest score somebody can get on LMArena?
Oh, that's a very good question. There is no highest score that you can get on LMArena. All that matters is the difference between any model score and any other model score. The highest we've seen so far is about 1501, but that's only relative to all the other models that are competing at the time.
So a new model could actually have the highest score after so many votes?
Yeah, a new model, if it has a strong win rate against the current models that are at the top of the leaderboard, it will get a higher score.
It's like sports.
Yeah, if you win all your matches, you'll be number one.
Does a model need to go head-to-head against every other model in the arena to rank first?
No. So that's the beauty of the Bradley-Terry model, is it was developed specifically to measure these cases where you can't have every competitor play against every other competitor. You can get a number of good pairs, and because we can learn the ratings of them relative to each other, we can produce a good global ranking, even if not every competitor has played against each other. The actual scores in the arena will be changing depending on who's competing in the arena.
So when you're talking about arena scores, is it wrong to call them ELO scores?
Yeah, so technically they're not an ELO score, and the biggest difference is that in ELO, the data is processed one match at a time, whereas in Bradley-Terry, the algorithm looks at the entire data set, and those ratings sort of encompass the entire history of votes rather than just the most recent ones.
So ELO scores might be prone to recency bias?
Exactly. So the ELO scores will have been updated on the most recent matches, and those will be a stronger contributor to the score. For example, if there's a lot of comparisons between Claude and ChatGPT, and there's some last week and ChatGPT happened to win most of those, and there's some this week and Claude happened to win most of those, we don't want to give an advantage to one just because one happened more recently, and that's what would happen with ELO. In Bradley-Terry, all of those results would be treated equally.
Why does LMArena use Bradley-Terry instead of ELO scores?
One of the reasons is to try to handle recency bias. We want to avoid having a bias towards whichever data happened to come in most recently, and we want to treat all of the data we collect equally over time. Another reason is that it's much more stable. So in ELO, random ordering can lead to a totally different leaderboard compared to what you might expect, whereas in Bradley-Terry, no matter the order that you compute it in, it will always give you the same result. So if you're familiar with machine learning terms like gradient descent, you can sort of understand ELO as gradient descent in an online fashion, where we fit the model on one row at a time. And Bradley-Terry is a batch learning algorithm, which would learn an optimal set of rankings on all of the data at once. How this relates to our leaderboard is that when we collect new data, we actually refit the entire leaderboard on all of the past data, not just incorporating the new rows like we would in an ELO system.
Is there anything else we should know about Bradley-Terry?
It's my favorite model.
Why?
I have a copy of the original paper from the 60s on my bookshelf.
Clayton, what is the style control?
Yeah, so style control is a feature that we have on our text leaderboard, and that's based on the observation that a user's vote isn't only based on the quality of the responses that they're seeing from the AI models. It's also dependent on the stylistic characteristics of those responses. So people have a tendency to vote for responses even if they're not necessarily better, but because they're longer or they're formatted nicely, they have a lot of lists, they have tables, they have markdown. The style control leaderboard is our way of trying to disentangle that information. So we add features for all of those stylistic elements to our statistical model, and then we compute a score that represents the probability that one model would be chosen over the other if all the stylistic features were held constant.
Oh, is this related to that rumor where some people will judge a model more positively if it has markdown?
There is actually some research to suggest that users are influenced by the stylistic features, and this is our response to try to disentangle those. But one observation that's been made is that some model providers will create models that are optimized towards long responses, friendly responses, or styled in all of these different ways in order to get users to vote for them, even if the model doesn't have additional capabilities or produce better responses.
In the early days of models, people kept coming out with these huge leaps in performance, like every model was better than another. And I heard that there's diminishing returns or smaller and smaller performance gains. Do you see that?
That's an interesting question, and I think there could be some truth to that. So there's a sense in which models are so good that they're producing responses that most of the people like most of the time. And so at that point, it becomes harder to produce a new model that people would vote for over the old ones at higher rates. And also there's a feature of the Bradley-Terry model where as the difference in scores becomes larger, there's a smaller and smaller gain in predictive probability that you would get. So if you're 400 points above someone, you would have a very high, I think a 10-to-1 odds of winning against them. But if you're 4,000, you only gain an additional few percent. Towards the end of the graph, it becomes flat. So we have seen over time in the arena that model scores of new models have trended up over time, and that's just reflective of the data. So the new models release, and people vote for those models at higher rates over the previous generation of models, and they get higher scores. I think that the history of the scores over LMArena indicate a pretty uniform increase in capabilities, and it's continuing through now.